Hello and welcome to Mabinda TV. So for now, I like to look at the recently held Ugandan elections. The recently held Ugandan elections in which President Museveni won by 71% of the vote. So basically, what do you think about the recent Ugandan elections in which President Museveni won by 98%, so 71%. So basically, he says there is no opposition in Uganda. That is what the president, that is what the president Yoweri Museveni says. He says there is no opposition in Uganda. So now, what do you think about that statement? His win is so decisive that basically Museveni can afford to dismiss all the opposition in Uganda. And I think right now what we need to be doing is to enhance democracy in Africa. We need to be enhancing democracy in Africa. And I think that's the way we are going to make sure that Africa indeed is in a democratic. We live in a democratic society. Of course, it's a chicken and egg issue whether effective democracy leads to sustained economic growth, or whether sustained economic growth leads to leads to leads to better democracy. But I think for now, Africa does not have liberal democracy. What Africa has is plural democracy, and I think that's participation by many players. And I think that is something we need to think about. I think even the U.S. right now is not in a liberal democracy. The U.S. right now is in a the U.S. right now, I think, I think a plural democracy, just like most African countries. Because for the most part, you can't think of Trump as being ideological. I don't think you can think of Trump as being ideological. Basically, he goes with the issue that is at hand, and that's the tragedy with Africa. Our politics is not ideological, but rather our politics is about the big man. Our politics is about a personality cult. So basically, people follow a person not because of the ideas, not because of what they'll do for their country in terms of an infrastructure plan, in terms of a jobs plan, in terms of a healthcare plan, in terms of an education plan. People elect an African president basically in terms of how emotionally they make them feel. Maybe it comes from our tribe and region. So basically, it will be the turn of our tribe to eat. And so basically, elections in Africa are ethnic based, and that's what slows the economic prospects for Africa. That is our democracy is about a tribe. Our democracy is about ethnic-based politics. Our politics is about regional orientation. That's how you have elections in Africa, and I don't think that's a good thing for Africa. I don't think that's a good thing for Africa. I just think that basically Africa needs to have an election that is an election. I think Africa needs to have an election that will be about ideas. Let people debate on ideas. Let's have a left of center political party. That's about collectivism. That's about that is the society. That's about equality of opportunity. That's a left of center party. Maybe where we focus on equality of opportunity, where we focus on getting everyone to the same starting lineup. Let's have such a democracy where we focus on getting everyone to the same starting lineup, and then of course the differences can be explained in terms of a skill, talent, creative genius streak, or a skill, a talent, a creative genius streak, or just simply having enormous hard work. So that's about individual. That's about equality of opportunity, or maybe a right of center party, that's focused on individual dynamism, while the individual creative genius shines through. I think when we have such a party to be about individual dynamism, about pulling yourself by your own bootstraps, and I think that's the way to be able to develop this continent. I think that's the way to be able to develop this continent. That's the way to be able to make Africa shine through. And I think when you have an Africa that shines through, when you have an Africa where liberal democracy works, I think that's the way you will be able to make sure that Africa is at the absolute leading edge of innovation. And I think when you have that, that's the way you will be able to focus on having just a minute. Just a minute. That's the way we will be able to have an Africa that is at an absolute leading edge of innovation. So basically, Africa needs to be at the absolute. Just a minute. Welcome back. So that's the way Africa is going to develop. That's the way Africa is going to be at the absolute leading edge of innovation. And I think that's the way we need to be able to develop a right of center party that's about individual dynamism and a left of center party that's really about a left of center party that's about equality of opportunity. So I think right now, and then when you have these two parties, that is a right of center party that's about equality, that's about individual dynamism, and a left of center party that's about equality of opportunity. That's the way we will be able to develop Africa to be in the states. So, what do you think about elections in Uganda? Do you think they are free and fair? Do you think they are free and fair? And of course, Bobby Wine has been, if he is not, he does not believe in the election results, then let him go to the courts. That's what people are telling Bobby Wine. That is, if he does not believe in the legality of the elections, then let him go to the courts. But I think, of course, we all know who will win in the court. It is Museveni who will win in the courts, basically because it is Museveni who will win in the courts, basically because in Africa, basically, the president is the one who appoints the judges. So basically, they are an extension of the executive. And so basically, it is President Museveni who will prevail in the court. So for Bobby Wine, I think the good thing is that for Bobby Wine, he is still young, so he can't contest for the presidency as many times as he wants, since basically he is still young and can contest for the presidency so many times. That's Bobby Wine, and I think, of course, he could reach 60 still contesting, but of course, when seven is no more, he will have to square it out with the son of Museveni, so that is Mohozi Kainerugaba, and I think that's going to play out. We will see how that will play out in the future. That is an electoral contest between Mozi Kainerugaba and, of course, Kiza Besigye. Of course, Kiza Besigye right now is in a military jail, and of course, maybe they want also to keep Bobby Wine in a military jail, but I think Bobby Wine escaped house arrest, and basically right now his whereabouts are not known. Maybe he's in some embassy in Uganda. Of course, maybe he's in the US embassy. Of course, the US right now does not take in asylum seekers or refugees. But I think for Bobby Wine, he could make his case that his life is in danger in Uganda. So basically, I think right now Bobby Wine is the most prominent figure in Uganda after Museveni. But I think he he needs to have an alternative vision for the people of Uganda. What's the alternative vision? I think the tragedy we have in Africa right now is that the difference between the ruling party and the opposition party is not in the difference between the ruling party and the opposition party right now. The difference is not in is not in ideology, or maybe like right of center party and left of center party. The difference between the ruling party and the opposition party right now is in tribe and region where they draw their support from. That's the difference between the ruling party and the opposition party, and that's something that we really need to think about. I think if we think about it that way, then you will find that the opposition in Uganda then needs to be able to, the opposition in Uganda needs to be able to sustain, the opposition in Uganda needs to be able to champion the people's interests. What is their work plan? What is their infrastructure plan? What is their jobs plan? What is their healthcare plan? I think that's how the opposition in Uganda can sustain their onslaught on. That's how the opposition in Uganda can sustain the onslaught on President Museveni. Because remember, President Museveni says if you want to get the presidency in Uganda, you better go to the bush as you want. So that's an armed rebellion in which Museveni says that's the only way he will get out of power. Yes, we acknowledge he made some sacrifices, but surely 40 years on, hasn't he recouped the risk he took in becoming, in liberating Uganda from Idi Amin? Hasn't he recouped all the risks plus profits in in ensuring that he in removing Idi Amin from power? Doesn't President Museveni think that he has recouped the risk he endured in removing Idi Amin from power? That's something I think that we need to ask. And I think when you consider it that way, then President Museveni is going to be a live president. President Museveni is going to be a live president. And I think when President Museveni is a live president, then I think that is a shame to us in Africa. What better way to show democracy works but by having leaders that can change of power? The former president of America, that is Ronald Reagan, said that. The former president of Uganda, Ronald Reagan, said that the change of power from one administration to another in the United States was simply a miracle. That is what Ronald Reagan said. That is the change of power from one administration to the other was simply a miracle. So basically, that means that in Africa also we need to be changing power. And I think the underlying theory of the short-term limits is that it is better to truncate the rule of a saint than to extend the reign of a despot. It is better to truncate the rule of a saint like Mandela than to extend the reign of a despot, say Idi Amin. So basically, I think for now, Uganda needs to be on the pathway to democracy. The Ugandan economy needs to be an $800 billion economy. That's where Uganda should be right now, not a paltry maybe $100 billion. Uganda's economy needs to be at least $800 billion. But then, of course, that follows maybe that should follow maybe a country where you have an economy that functions, a country that value adds. Basically, a cotton that's exported from Uganda to Italy creates 13 times more jobs in Italy than it does in Uganda. So you can imagine cotton that is exported from Uganda to Italy creates 13 times more jobs in Italy than it does in Uganda. So you can imagine the kind of you can imagine the kind of so you can imagine the kind of value addition that goes on in Uganda. So take your time. The kind of you can imagine the kind of value addition that goes on to cotton in Uganda. So I think President Museveni right now, I think President Museveni right now should be able to I think President Museveni right now should be able to cede power. Let him cede power. Basically, he has ruled. What more could Museveni do for Uganda that he has not done right now? That's what we need to ask. What more could President Museveni do for Uganda that he has not already done? Basically, nothing. And I think that's the way we need to evaluate his presidency. Basically, the presidency of Yoweri Museveni right now I think is about personality cult, is about a pilferaging. Remember, in 2006, when his daughter wanted to give birth, he did not give birth in Ugandan hospital. No, she was flown all the way to Germany in order to give birth. So Museveni cannot trust his doctors. Basically, he has to go to Germany. His daughter had to go to Germany to deliver, so he cannot trust the Ugandan doctor. So basically, if he cannot trust the Ugandan doctor, then why is he spending the taxpayers' money in training them in the first place at Makerere University and other universities? Why is he spending so much money in Makerere University and all other universities? That's basically an own goal for President Museveni, and I think he needs to be able to. President Museveni needs to be able to trust more on his own doctors. So I think right now, Bobby Wine, of course, the military is after Bobby Wine, and so he is not known where he is. His whereabouts are not known, but I think he could be hiding in some embassy or maybe has flown out of the country. Of course, his family will be tormented because of that. String, and I think what needs to happen is just that Africa needs to be able to have leaders that are at the absolute leading edge of innovation. So, what do you think about the Ugandan elections? Were they free and fair? Are they about vote? The other thing about elections is it depends on the electoral referee. Remember, it is the president in Africa who appoints the electoral referee. Basically, it is the president who appoints the electoral referee. Basically, how can then an opposition candidate win against a candidate that he has appointed in the first place? That just shows you how it is very difficult for an opposition candidate to win an election in Africa. So basically, I think President Museveni needs to be able to just allow for democratic space in for to allow for democratic space in Uganda. So I think President Museveni needs to allow for democratic space in Uganda. So basically, that's how I think Uganda could develop. So we need both sustained economic growth and effective democracy in order for Africa to function well. So I think that is how I think Uganda can have free, fair, credible, verifiable elections. So that's it about elections in Uganda. About then, of course, still in Uganda, a young mayor a young MP has been elected on the National Unity Party. A young MP has been elected in the National Unity Party, in the NUP. A young MP has been elected. So basically, that Uganda that the opposition is a homage to young politicians, and I think Africa's young need to know this is a continent. This is where their fortunes lie. Africa is the youngest continent. At just 19 years of age, Africa is the youngest continent. And so basically, that's why you have the likes of Bill Gates telling us to narrow down the population of Africans because we are the youngest continent. And so basically, that means we are the future workforce of the world. Others are the future workforce of the world. And of course, you have those who want Africans to not kill each other. They are telling Africans that they are telling Africans that they basically need to be able to we are telling Africans that they need to be able to not they need not to have more children, maybe have just one child policy like China. So Africa is the youngest continent, but are these young people interested in politics? I think politics is viewed as a dirty game, one played by all politicians. So Africans are into entertainment and sports, and it's not bad to be into entertainment. That's the stage of life where basically you want to dance to Michael Jackson's song or listen to listen to Bob Dylan music or listen to Wizkid music Burna Boy music, maybe Davido music, and I think or Diamond Platinum's music. That's a stage of life, and I think when you have an Africa where you have, I think when you have an Africa, when the young are into entertainment and sports, so you have very few getting on the deep issues of the day, and maybe that's why urban FM stations are making a lot of money because young Africans are into entertainment and sports. They don't want the deep issues of the day, issues that will force them to think through on what they are made of, and so that's how I think that Africa can really prosper. So, what is the other issue about the election of Uganda? It is that the opposition party swept the seats in opposition areas. The opposition party swept the seats in opposition areas. I think that's I think that's the other takeaway from the Ghana elections. That is, the opposition party swept the opposition party swept the seats in. That is, the opposition party swept the seats in urban areas. So I think in a lot of urban areas, there are usually strongholds for the opposition. I just think that maybe the urban population is more enlightened. They have interacted with the best democracies from around the world. So basically, they are more receptive to the message from the opposition as opposed to the rural folk who most of the times as opposed to the rural folk who most of the times want to rural folk who most of the times vote for the ruling party. I think most dictators love the rural folk because they could just be bribed with $1, with $2, and then they vote for the sitting government. But the urban population wants better healthcare, they want better education, they want better infrastructure, and they want access to jobs, and so that's why then they are willing. That's why then urban populations in Africa have really most of the times they vote for the opposition candidate. And I think that's the way to be able to. I think that's the way to be able to balance this trade. And so, what that means is that we need prosperity. Basically, for Africa, we need prosperity. That's just the way it is. We need prosperity for Africa. So maybe even democracy, we should not be chasing democracy in the first place. Maybe what we need for in the first place is prosperity, because I think democracy, when you think about it, it is a luxury, because for you to interrogate a candidate based on the job plan, you need a certain level of education, you need a certain level of material success for you to want to a candidate that can ensure you get more of that. So I think that's why then the middle class, even in America, it is the middle class that sustains that democracy. And one of the reasons why democracy in America is failing is because the middle class is winnowing out, the middle class is hollowing out. That's why democracy in America is failing. Of course, for America, you have Donald Trump saying that in America, you have Donald Trump saying that basically he likes them uneducated. That's what Donald Trump says. He likes them uneducated. So that means that Donald Trump likes them uneducated. So that's why the middle class has hollowed out in America, and that's why they follow the personality cult of Donald Trump. I think we need the middle class in Africa to be the largest class. Right now, Africa, the political pact is a process. The political process in Africa is a pact between the high between the super rich who make the rules and provide the funds and the downtrodden poor who ensure the decisions of the super rich are enforced. So the middle class is left out, and that is just bad. If the middle class could transfer just 1% of the ingenuity they use in managing trillions of shareholder capital, if the middle class in Africa could transfer just 1% of the ingenuity they use in managing trillions of shareholder capital, Africa would be heaven indeed. Just imagine the ingenuity the middle class uses in managing trillions of shareholder capital. Just think about how the private sector has held Africa together. They are the reason Africa is the way they are. They provide the jobs. They provide the jobs. They make sure that kids go to school. They make sure that they provide, they start companies and they employ kids that go to school. And that is the way that we can ensure that the middle class is indeed sustained. So basically, I think just imagine that the way the middle class in Africa. Rally copy. Just imagine that the middle class in Africa, if the middle class in Africa manage trillions of shareholder capital, just imagine they run the companies like Unilever, like Procter and Gamble, like Coca-Cola, like companies like Daily Nation Media Group, companies like Channel Television. These are companies that are run by middle class Africans. But then, of course, they are the ones who sustain the African economy. So imagine that these Africans sustain these economies, but then they don't have a political voice, and that just means that they don't have a political voice, and so that means that the decisions are made by people who have never gone to school, people who don't know what better governance means, and so that means that Africans are able to. That means that Africans are able to shore up their numbers. That means that Africans are able to go to school. Africans are able to get meaningful jobs post graduation. Look at the job situation in Africa right now. Basically, you have an African, you have people even graduating with PhDs and they are bus drivers. I'm not saying being a bus driver is bad, but if you have a PhD, then you should be looking forward to a prosperous life. Someone such as of course, someone such as Robert Kiyosaki, the author of The Rich Dad Poor Dad, says that you should not be, that is, says a PhD should, rich dad, poor dad. He says the poor dad follows education while the rich dad uses education to get wealthy. So imagine the kind we are producing about 5 million Africans that are going to the job market every year. Do we have the jobs for them, the meaningful jobs for them that they can do? Maybe that's what we need to be asking. Do we have meaningful jobs for these Africans? Are we able to create the kind of jobs that will be at the absolutely bleeding edge of innovation? Are we producing jobs that will make Africans really go? Really be at the touch of innovation. Look at China. Instead of Google, they have Byte.com. Instead of Twitter, X, and Facebook, they have Weibo. Instead of YouTube, they have TikTok. Instead of maybe Microsoft, they don't have, but they have also aviation companies that can take on Airbus and Boeing. So you can imagine that for Chinese, recently they had a profit surplus of 1.2 trillion dollars. That's the trade surplus they have with the rest of the world. So imagine, made in China brand. It used to be weak in quality, but right now it is a very strong quality. Right now, the made in China brand is a very, very strong brand. It started out low, but they gradually invested their profits back to R&D, and so that that means that Africans need to be able to create jobs at home, and that means we need to be able to have the right ways. And if we had a venture capital market, if we had a venture market maybe of about $100 billion, I think will create the right kind of companies to be able to blossom in Africa. If Aliko Dangote is worth $20 billion by investing in only a handful of African countries. How rich could he be if he invested in the whole in the whole of Africa? That is something that I invite you to interrogate. If Aliko Dangote is worth $20 billion by investing only in a handful of African countries, how rich would he be if he invested in all of African countries? And easily 100, easily $200 billion. He could be the richest man in the world. But that is something that maybe we have not thought through. So basically, right now, the best ideas in Africa are by young people. We need to be able to pull them away from us. I'm not saying pull them literally, but in addition to sports and entertainment, we need to be able to make these Africans really enjoy. We need to be able to make these Africans at least be young Africans be interested in politics, be interested in the deep issues of the day so that they can transfer the ingenuity they use in managing trillions of shareholder capital. They invest that capital, that ingenuity back to politics. And maybe we could, to make it easier to have Africans that are seeking political seats. Maybe let's have political parties that are like record labels or book publishers, so that when they are running for office, we provide them with funds, and then maybe we're going to deduct from their salary. That's how we could do it, so that when they are hungry, and when they win the seat, then we can deduct them slowly, salary slowly. And I think I will invite you to interrogate how come that, for instance, in Kenya, politicians are using more funds to campaign than they will get once they are in office. Imagine. I think let me use the Kenyan situation. A politician in Kenya earns about, I think, that's a million shillings. That's about $10,000 per month. In 5 years, that will in a year that will be about 12 million shillings. In 5 years, that will be 60 million shillings. That's about $600,000. But then, of course, when they get to office, what they will use, that's what they'll get once in office. But they campaign using, for an MP, they use up to 100 million shillings. So basically, that's $1 million. So they go at a loss of about $400,000. So where do you think they're doing charity work? No, they're not doing charity work. Our politicians are not doing charity work. Our politicians are in it for themselves. Money from once they get that money from politics, they will simply use that money to campaign. They will simply be corrupt. And when we don't donate to our political candidates, what does that mean? They will go on and be given money, dirty money from money launderers, from drug dealers, from corrupt thieves. That is the people that will finance our politicians. When we don't donate, let's build a culture of donations in our political leaders. When we build a culture of donations in our political leaders, that's the way we could change Africa. That's the way we could make Africa really be better governed. So basically, we need to have a culture of donation. Let's donate $10. Let's donate $20 to our politicians. That's the way we could build a culture of political donations. And I think when we build a culture of political donations, that's the way we could. That's the way we could make sure that we have politics that we have leaders that are truly accountable to us. Look at Barack Obama. He rose because he was donated too. He did not come from a millionaire family. He simply had the better ideas on how America should be governed. And so when he stood up to make the speech that made Obama, so basically the speech that made Obama. So basically, we had the speech that made Obama, and basically it was about the speech that made Obama, and so basically it was about a speech that was that really will capture the heart and soul of America. And that's how Obama was donated to $10, $20. That's how he came from nowhere and became president of the United States of America. So right now, I think we need a presidency. We need young people to get to this elective point. That's how they enact change. Yes, it's good to demonstrate, but demonstrations don't carry any meaningful change. I'm talking about the demonstrations in Tanzania, Uganda, in Nigeria, in Kenya. Basically, the youth came out to demonstrate against bad governance, but those demonstrations don't carry any weight at all if we are not able those demonstrations don't carry any weight at all if then we are not able to translate that word. So basically, let's go to the polling booths. Let the young people go to the polling booths, and that's where the change of governance is in the ballot. Otherwise, we will continue having the same bad leaders that we complain about, and I think it will not be so good for us. Just a break. That's the way we're going to make Africa really, really prosperous. And I think when we make Africa prosperous, that's because we have issue-oriented leaders. When we have issue-oriented leaders, that's the way we can have a culture of political donation. So, number one, let's have ideological parties that are left wing, left of center, parties that are right of center. Number two, let's have a culture of donations. And number three, let's turn up at the polling booths. So when we turn up at the polling booths, that's the way we can have effective change. And when we have effective change, that's the way this continent will be changed. That's the way this marvelous continent sitting on at least $500 trillion worth of natural resources. That's how it will be changed, and that's how this country will have better ideas. Africa can be a $500 trillion economy. Of course, that's someone that is dreaming. We are barely a $1.5 trillion economy. So how can one dream that Africa can be a $500 trillion economy? I'm not far off, really. Imagine DR Congo alone, the economy of DR Congo alone, it is worth the mineral wealth potential of DR Congo alone is worth $30 trillion. But that's if you convert cotton to designer clothes, if you convert titanium to aeroplane parts, if you convert gold and diamond to jewelry, if you convert coffee to coffee drinking chains, if you convert uranium to nuclear power, if you convert coltan to mobile phone and computers, if you convert copper to electronics, if you convert that is gold and diamond to jewelry, if you convert that is wood to paper, if you convert I think if you do value addition, that's the way you're gonna have an economy that is worth $30 trillion. So basically, if DR Congo alone is worth $30 trillion, I think then Africa could be worth $500 trillion economy. You would think of Niger, one in three bars in France is powered by uranium from Niger. So you can imagine how African countries are subsidizing the Western countries. I think you had the late former French president Jacques Chirac say that if not for Africa, France would be a third world country. That is what you had. That is what you. That is what you had the former president of France said, Jacques Chirac said, without Africa and its exploitation, Africa will be a third world country. That's what the former president of France, the late former president of France, Jacques Chirac said. If not for Africa, without Africa and its exploitation, France would be a third world country. So that's it about that's it about that is basically Building a culture of political donations, having ideological parties conducting free and fair elections. That's the other segment we need to be looking at. Let's have a culture of political donations. Let's have a culture. Number one, let's have ideological parties. Number two, let's have a culture of political donations. Number three, turn up at the polling booths, go and vote for your preferred candidate. Let that candidate be the one with the better infrastructure plan, with a better jobs plan, with a better education plan. Number four is let's have an election that is above board, because an election is how we change leaders. That's how we change leaders. That's how through an election is how we change leaders. And when you have us changing leaders through elections, that's how then we will be able to solve this. We'll be able to make Africa truly prosperous. So let's change leaders through the ballot box, not rigging elections. Rigging elections just gives us bad leaders, and you find many opposition candidates in Africa. They don't have faith in the electoral system. Many opposition leaders in Africa don't have faith in the electoral system, and so they prefer to hold protests. You saw protests in Tanzania, in which about 1,000 people were killed. In Uganda, about a dozen Ugandans killed in post-election violence. You had in Kenya in post-election violence of 2008. 2007, 2008, about 1,300 Kenyans perished. Post-election violence in you have post-election violence in which other country? In Nigeria, you had post-election violence in Mozambique. So basically, we need to be able to hold free, fair, credible, verifiable election in which we can change our leaders. That's how we can get leaders that are truly meant for Africa. That's how we can get leaders that will truly reflect the will of the Africans. And I think when we get such leaders, that is the way Africa will be able to prosper. Look at China under Deng Xiaoping in the ruling between 1980 and 1990. When he opened up market reforms, he is largely credited with the capitalistic Chinese businesses. When he opened up market reforms so that then there could be investors in China, he helped the Chinese economy grow by double digits year on year for 30 years. That started in 1980s. The Chinese started growing double digits year on year for 30 years. The Chinese that's how the Chinese grew the economy by double digits year on year for about 30 years. And so when they grew the economy year on year for 30 years, that's how they were able to leapfrog. And I think until they became the second largest economy in the world. I think maybe they may have even surpassed the United States. Frankly, I think China could have surpassed the United States in terms of economy, but I think it will never be announced. I think right now they put the U.S. economy at $22 trillion and the Chinese economy at $19 trillion. But who will announce that China is now the world's largest economy? Maybe that's why the U.S. has the largest military in the world to be able to attack any media house. But I think if the Chinese economy continues growing at 5-7%, it could overtake the US by the year 2028. About 2 years from now, the Chinese economy could be the largest economy in the world, and of course, that will spell doom for the United States. And so, of course, the Chinese economy that just shows us alternative leadership, about leadership that maybe the communism is not bad at all. Maybe communism is not bad, but I think it is not pure communism. I think the businesses are capitalistic, because I think right now China has more billionaires than the United States. You can imagine that right now China has more billionaires than the United States, so you can imagine that the economy. So you can imagine that the economy of China is could be bigger than the United States. So that's it about having a free, fair, credible, verifiable election. Then another story from the Daily Monitor. Another story from the Daily Monitor. Let me see if we have another story. Another story from the Daily Monitor. Uh, Another story from the Daily Monitor. That's about Kiza Besigye accessing special healthcare. Kiza Besigye is the opposition leader of Uganda. Let Besigye access special healthcare. Doctors tell government that let Besigye, Kiza Besigye access special healthcare. That is what doctors are telling the Ugandan government. Of course, Kiza Besigye was a personal doctor of Kiza Besigye was a personal doctor of President Yoweri Museveni, but they fell out, of course, and now Kizza Besigye finds himself in uncharted waters. He finds himself that maybe even Museveni wants to kill him. Basically, he is the opposition figure that has contested against Museveni for the updated time, and of course, he has his support, and then Bobi Wine also has his support. So it appears it is Bobi Wine who took over from where Kizza basically left. But why are we treating opposition figures in Africa in this way? Why are we treating opposition figures in Africa this way? It is not right at all. We are treating the opposition figures in Africa very, very badly, and I think that is something that we need to interrogate. That is something that we really need to think through. It is not right the way we are treating opposition figures in Africa. They provide the alternative form of government, and so for opposition, I would like to believe that the opposition must be able to. I would like to believe that the opposition must be able to be the alternative government. Let them have a shadow cabinet. I would hope that every opposition party in Africa has a shadow government. Every opposition party in Africa has I would believe that every opposition party in Africa let it have a shadow cabinet, let them hold the government accountable, and that's how we will be able to. That is how we will be able to then have an Africa that truly functions. And I think that's how we will make Africa function. That is how Africa will leapfrog the world. That is how Africa will leapfrog the world. That is how Africa will be able that's how Africa will be able to develop. Then I'll move over to Nigeria and look some of the issues in Nigeria. Nigeria, number one, decades of trade deals failed to win Nigeria off crude oil dependence. Decades of trade deals failed to win Nigeria off crude oil dependence. So Nigeria is a typical African country. Nigeria is a typical African country. It is Nigeria has dependence on oil. And so when oil was discovered in Nigeria, it led to the cost of that is the cost of oil. That is the cost of oil. And I think what we need to be able to we need to be able to find other ways in which the economy of Africa can grow. And I think that's the cost of mineral resources. That's the cost of mineral resources. Yes, I mean. Meanwhile, what do you think about the final between Senegal and what do you think about the final between Senegal and Morocco? Meanwhile, as we get back to the main topic at hand, what do you think about the final between Senegal and Morocco? Was it a good final? Was it a good final? Was it a good final? Let me think about it. Then I'll tell you. Just a minute. So that follows then Nigeria. When oil was discovered, Nigeria never developed other sectors of the economy, such as oil, and Nigeria never developed the other sectors of the economy, such as agriculture. And I think that is why we need to be able to diversify the economy of Africa. So I think the cost of oil in Africa has been well documented. The cost of oil, the cost of mineral resources. When mineral resources are discovered in a country, instead of those resources helping uplift the economy of that country, it becomes a source of strife, a source of instability, a source of civil war, a source of poverty. So basically, imagine a country such as DR Congo sitting on $30 trillion worth of mineral resources. Countries in the states, Eastern DR Congo is ungovernable. The country is ungovernable. The country, the size of Western Europe, is ungovernable simply because it has immense mineral resources. You don't need to dig deep to find mineral resources in DR Congo. You just need to plow your hand through the soil and you will have gold, you will have oil, you will have diamond, you will have gold. And that's why then these Western multinationals want that conflict to continue so that they can freely mine off the mineral resources of that country. And I think that is something that we need to be able to explore. And I think when you have mineral resources of a country not benefiting the people, then for what reason are those mineral resources are there in the first place? So, of course, the Congo could be the world's largest economy at $30 trillion. The US is an economy of $22 trillion. Then, of course, you have, then of course you have, is it? Then of course you have is it which is the other economy that is the other economy is China at $19 trillion, then the European Union at about $15 trillion. So of course you have the DR Congo economy could be $30 trillion, but that's if it value adds, and they don't need to start great. They can't start out average. Even the Japanese brands did not start out great. You had the Japanese brands such as Sony, Toshiba, Panasonic, Toyota, Mitsubishi, Isuzu, Mitsubishi. They didn't start out great, but they gradually improved the quality until such a time. They gradually improved the quality until such a time when they gradually improved the quality until such a time they gradually improve the quality until until they surpass the Western brands in quality. Remember Gemba Kaizen, continuous improvement. That's the metric of the Japanese manufacturing companies. That is continuous improvement. Every time they are improving on the quality. Gemba Kaizen, improving on the quality every time, and that's how then the Japanese are able to improve. I think the West played America played some dirty games on Japan. Maybe that's why Japan economy has staggered since 1990. But if it could have done by double digits since 1990, it could have surpassed even the US economy. Now they're playing the same games on China. I don't know whether that will be successful or not. I don't know whether that will be successful or not, but I think now the Japanese plans, and that's why Japan is known as the land of lifelong employment. In Japan, if you get a job, then you are likely to stick to that company till your retirement. So you can imagine how job security is assured in Japan. That is, if you get a job in a company, then likely you will work for that company for the entirety of your life. But of course, then the slowing of the Japanese economy has meant that maybe there has been some layoffs, but that is quite unprecedented in Japanese land. And of course, China is trying to copy that model. Of course, China is developing its military capabilities so that then and China is developing its military capabilities so that then the economy of the military prowess of China is not dependent on America. Remember, after the Japanese were defeated by the United States after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki after Japan surrendered in the World War II. And then, of course, the US wrote a pacifist constitution for Japan in which Japan would rely on US for its military interests. Of course, Donald Trump has suspended that. Of course, Donald Trump has suspended that, and of course, maybe the Japanese are beginning to invest some of their money into back into their military. But you can imagine, just imagine the economy of Japan. Just imagine the economy of Japan. Just imagine the economy of Japan. It is dependent on the United States. I mean, the military of Japan is dependent on the security of Japan is dependent on the United States. So I think African companies can start out small, where the Made in Africa brand can start out small, can start out average, then gradually reinvest the profits back to R&D, and that is why maybe the unity in Africa that we seek should not be maybe the unity that we seek in Africa should not be one of geographical span, but one of absolute Afrocentrism. That's what I think should happen. The unity we seek in Africa should not be one of geographical span, but one of absolute Afrocentrism. That is why that is why then Africa could be that is why then Africa could be a $500 trillion economy. That looks like a colossal amount of. Imagine if Africa was a $500 trillion economy. Every African would be worth about $500,000, $500 million, and that could really trigger off a prosperous life like never seen before. So I think Africans can can and should value add. We train engineers. For what purpose are we training engineers if they cannot they cannot mine our minerals? So how are we training our geologists, our engineers, if they cannot mine our minerals at a good enough price? So then I think Africans should be able to live a good life. Africans still be able to be prosperous in our own land. These are God-given resources. So why is it that we are not benefiting them from these resources? And that's why for Nigeria, a country such as Qatar has the same oil resources as Nigeria, but then Qatar has a per capita of $200,000, while Nigeria has a per capita of only about 1,800, and so only about 2,000. So that shows you that Qatar uses its oil for the benefit of the people, even if it's managed by a king. So then, of course, Nigeria is managed by a president. So that means that Nigeria is mismanaging its oil resources. And of course, you had the Ogoni, the leader of the Ogoni people, Ken Saro-Wiwa, when he attempted to you have the leader of the Ogoni people, Ken Saro-Wiwa, when he asked why mineral resources were not benefiting the people of his country. What did he say? What did Shell and the other companies do to him? They said that they executed him. The Sani Abacha dictator, Sani Abacha regime executed him basically because he was demanding for oil resources to benefit his people. So basically, that is the way of oil. It is dirty money. It brings civil strife to African countries. It brings conflicts. It brings poverty, and that's why mineral resources have been a curse. But they can be for good if we utilize. Look at Norway. It has a sovereign fund where each Norwegian has about 200,000 in sovereign wealth funds. And so basically, why not create a sovereign wealth fund for our minerals so that when we export value-added goods and services, then we invest them for future generations. Right now, we are bequeathing our future generations with poverty. Look at the public debt of African countries in their trillions, and so the public debt in African countries is in the trillions, and this means that then that oil is not helping our people at all, and so that means that our mineral resources are not benefiting our people. And so I think Africans need to be able to benefit from their own oil resources. That's the way we are going to make sure that Africans truly prosper in the continent. So that's it about from the Nigerian Guardian. So let me look at another Nigerian headline. Let me see whether I can get another Nigerian headline. Let me see. Let me see whether I can get another Nigerian. Another Nigerian headline. Let me see whether I can get another Nigerian headline. Let me see whether I can get another Nigerian headline. Another Nigerian headline. Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Gani Adams urges reversal of mother tongue removal from Nigerian curriculum. Uh, so mother tongue was removed from the Nigerian curriculum. So what does that mean? Mother tongue is not taught in Nigerian curriculum. So I think in the early stages of learning, I think they taught mother tongue, but now it's removed from the Nigerian curriculum. So why is it so? I think that's a very bad. That's a very bad. That's a very bad move because children learn better when they are taught in a language they understand. And since they are at home, they learn mother tongue. But then when they go to school, they have to speak English. And so, of course, you'll see in middle class homes in Africa, basically, you will see that they glorify teaching their kids English. And so, basically, they will teach their kids English when they could learn mother tongue and they could learn faster in mother tongue. I think for the countries such as Japan and China, one of the reasons why they have grown so much is because they are able to teach their kids in language they understand. Even up to university, they teach in Chinese up to university. In Japan, they teach Japanese even up to university. So basically, that's how these countries have been able to prosper. But then in Africa, we are forced to either learn English or these colonial languages, either English or French or Spanish or Portuguese, depending on who your colonizer was. So that means that then we have when you speak your mother tongue, you are seen as more advanced, you're seen as more sophisticated, you're seen as an elite when you speak the Queen's language, when you speak French, when you speak and when you speak Spanish, you are seen as sophisticated, you are seen as rich and powerful. So basically, that's what happens that's what happens, and that's why maybe our children are not understanding. Imagine if mathematics was taught in your mother tongue, you could easily have understood it. Imagine if physics, if chemistry, if biology was taught in your mother tongue, you could easily understand that term. And so I think that is just the way it is. And I think that teaching of language in mother tongue, I think it's going to that teaching of language in mother tongue, I think it's a good thing, and I think it needs to be inserted in the early years of your education. That's when your mind is most formidable. That's how you are able to grasp things faster, and maybe only teach English in universities and in the workplace. Of course, most African countries have how many tribes. So basically, that then becomes an issue. Which language do you teach? But I think allowing mother tongue in the early years of education basically reinforces the country's ability to be able to compete at the international level, and that's how then you are able to. And that's how you are able to solve the deep issues of the day. And I think that is how. And I think we need a super language in Africa. I think we just need a super language, and that language that I propose is Kiswahili. Kiswahili is right now spoken by 200 million Africans. So that means it started in East Africa. Of course, it is a confluence of Bantu languages plus some Arabic plus some other languages, but 85% of Kiswahili is Bantu language, and I think it can be the lingua franca of Africa. So basically, I think it's the language we can export. That's Kiswahili. I think what needs to happen then, basically, is for Kiswahili to be, I think what needs to happen is for Kiswahili to be recognized as an official language. And I think for Tanzania, they teach their kids how to form for in Kiswahili, and maybe that's why they have a semblance of stability, save for these laws of innocence with the Samia Suluhu win of 88%, creating a post-election violence. So basically, I think that creating a post-election violence in Tanzania that cost the country its innocence, and of course, Kiswahili can be Africa's lingua franca. Frankly, the beauty about it is it is not associated with any one tribe. That is Kiswahili. It is not associated with any one tribe, so it can quickly be Africa's lingua franca. I think it is a language of the African Union also. So when it becomes when we teach our students in Kiswahili, they will be able to understand things better, and that's how then Kiswahili can be a lingua franca for Africa. I think what Kiswahili just lacks is a super technical structure. That's according to the late Philip Cheng. Of course, he says that Kiswahili just lacks, what it lacks is a super technical structure. It is not the language of technology, and so we need to be able to have a research arm of Kiswahili that can give us basically the technical terms. Maybe a computer in Kiswahili is taraknishi, mobile phone is simu ya rununu, maybe which other device. Then you have email is barua pepe, but I think we need to have a super technical structure for Kiswahili so that it cannot just be a language where we speak, but also a language of technology, a language of commerce. That's how we'll make Kiswahili be Africa's lingua franca. And if it is not going to butcher other languages, of course, some will protest. We need our Yoruba, we need our, some will protest, we need our Yoruba, we need our, some will protest, we need our Yoruba, we need our Kikuyu, we need our Hausa, we need our Hausa, we need our Zulu. It is not going to kill other languages. Basically, what Kiswahili will do, even for the Chinese, Mandarin is the language they export. For the Chinese, Mandarin is the language they export, but then the other Chinese speak Cantonese. So you can imagine other Chinese speak Cantonese, but it is Mandarin they export the same way. The people can speak Hausa, they can speak Yoruba, they can speak Zulu, they can speak Ndebele, Shona, Kikuyu, Kalenjin, Nuwe, Dinka, Ewe. They can speak Ashanti, Mandago. They can't speak those languages, Mandinka. So, but it is Kiswahili that we can export as a language. And when we have one language like that, that's how Africa will be able to prosper. That's how Africa will be able to develop a cultural heritage. Remember, I said to be a superpower, you need to have political power, economic power, and social cultural power. You need all those three to be able to be a superpower. But then, of course, social cultural power that will happen with Kiswahili as our lingua franca. We could export Kiswahili, and that's how it could become our lingua franca. So that's it about Kiswahili. Let me look another headline. So that's about Nigeria and Nigerian protesting against the removal of mother tongue from the curriculum. So that's it from that is from the Guardian. Let me see whether I can see another headline from the Guardian. Another headline from the Guardian. Uh, Let me see another headline from the Guardian. Whether I can see another headline from the Guardian. Let me see. Let me see. Let me see another headline from the Guardian. From the Guardian. Uh, from the Guardian. I am not seeing another headline from the Guardian. Let me see whether I will have an opinion. Uh, uh, Let me see whether I have another opinion from the Guardian. Uh-huh. Let me see whether I have another headline from the Guardian. From the Guardian newspaper. From the Guardian newspaper. From the Guardian newspaper. From the Guardian newspaper, there's no other headline. So let me move over to Punch newspapers in Nigeria. Punch newspaper, Nigeria. Let me see whether I can get another headline from the Punch newspapers, Nigeria. Let me see whether I can get another newspaper from Nigeria. I will look at the headline. I look at the headline. Let me see. So this is what I will see. Let me see. Let me see what they can. So basically, Kiswahili can be the lingua franca for Africa. We don't, where we can have a Kiswahili being the lingua franca for Africa. I think it can go a long way in making Africa a superpower. So that's it from the Guardian. That's it from the Guardian Nigeria. That's it from the Guardian Nigeria. Then from the Citizen Tanzania. From the Citizen Tanzania. From the Citizen Tanzania. From the Citizen Tanzania. Let me look at this one. From the Citizen Tanzania. How research is refining palm oil value chain to boost incomes. Research. So, what do you think about research? I think our universities are not doing enough to research. They are basically teaching universities. And our universities have turned into teaching universities where they are not even, they are not even, our universities have turned into teaching institutions only. And so this happened under the World Bank, where the World Bank said where the World Bank said that basically African universities should not be concentrating on higher education. They should leave that to the West and concentrate on basic education. That is what the World Bank said, that African countries should concentrate on basic education and leave higher education for the Western countries, because it is the basic education that was going to help them. So basically, that is how African countries were told they must concentrate on, and that was through the structural adjustment programs of the World Bank and IMF. And so, of course, a lot of African countries did not think university education was free, and so this is how they started this system of copaying. They started this system of copaying. Welcome back. This is the Good Evening Africa show. This is the Good Evening Africa show, where we look at all matters Africa and the world, the deep issues of the day in Africa. This is the Good Evening Africa show, where we look at the top issues in Africa and the world. So basically, right now, I'm looking at the top headlines in the top stories in Africa. So I'm looking at research in. Do you think African universities are doing enough research? Do you think African universities are doing enough research? So they are not doing enough research, and so that means then that we can basically resources in Africa can should be channeled towards research. And I know basically in the short term, research does not pay. But I think in the medium to long term, research does pay. And this is what I think that there needs to be long term investment in our research. This is why there needs to be long term investment in our research. That's how Africa is going to grow. And I think we have so many problems in Africa. This is a rich ground for research. So why are we not having research in Africa? That's what I should be asking. Why are we not having a long-term investment in research? That's the way we should be able to make sure that there is enough research. Research doesn't pay in the short term, but in the medium to long term, it does pay. Look at America, look at Europe. They were able to colonize the world because of knowledge. These Western countries colonized the world because of knowledge. That's according to Jeffrey Sachs, because they invented the gunpowder, and that is why they were able to silence, of course, the printing press and the gunpowder. That's how they were able to colonize the rest of the world. Of course, the Chinese claim that they discovered the gunpowder, and of course, their printing press also was discovered in China. That's what China claims. But at least we could go by what the Westerners say. They discovered the gunpowder and I think what the other thing they discovered, the gunpowder and the printing press. That is how then they were able to. That is how then they were able to leapfrog the world and rule the world. That's according to Jeffrey Sachs, professor of sustainable studies, Global Arts Institute at Columbia University. So that's it about research, and I think our universities have turned into only teaching, and so that means that they are elevated high schools. They are not producing new knowledge. Africa has so many problems. There's problems in food security, problems in hunger, problems in mobility, problems in urban urban studies. All these areas, Africa has huge problem. But then, of course, that doesn't help at all. I think what needs to happen is Africa needs to be able to concentrate and research on its deep issues of the day and what really is Africa. That's how Africa is going to advance. That's how Africa will be able to. That's how Africa will be able to be the leading center of that is be the catalyst for change in the world. And I think Africa really could be the engine of growth for the world. Really, Africa could be the engine of growth for the world. So Africa could be the engine of growth for the world. And I think if that happens, then Africa, and outsiders notice this, but Africans, for some reason, Africans don't think that we are the next frontier, we're the next gold rush, as the flamboyant former radio queen. That is Caroline Toko says, Africa does not need aid, it needs audacity. So Africans don't notice that which is in the vicinity. They don't notice that they are the next frontier. Africa is the next frontier. Africa is the next continent, but we don't notice at all. It is outsiders who are noticing that we are the next frontier. So basically, that's it about research, and I think that's research. And then, of course, the other thing is about what kind of education should Africans have. Maybe that's the question we need to ask. What kind of education should Africans have? I think Africans could have an education that is both for the mind and for the skill. Of course, some people are asking, of what use will knowing Vasco da Gama help me? That's what some people are asking. Of what use will knowing Vasco da Gama help me? Of what use will knowing Vasco da Gama help me? That's what some people are asking. And I think then that is not a question to ask. I think that's a question to ask some other time. What use will studying Vasco da Gama help me? I think that's what these people are asking, but I don't think that's the right question to ask. I think what use, how will we develop the mind? That is what we need to ask in the first place. Just a minute. So, what do you think about the game between Senegal and Morocco? Mhm. What do you think about the game between Senegal and Morocco? Hmm? What do you think about the game between Senegal and Morocco? Hajakuja bado. Africans should be able to have an education that trains for both the skill and the mind. So basically, the arts education is about developing the mind, while the arts education is about developing the mind, while the technical education is developing the skill. So, for instance, you could have a degree in history or anthropology. Look at American leaders, they are all trained in the liberal arts. They believe the liberal arts opens your mind, but then, of course, they believe the liberal arts opens your mind. That's why then you have that sort of education. But then, of course, they believe that the liberal arts opens your mind. But then, of course, you have those who argue for the on-the-job skills. They believe that the technical skills are what will give you a job. So for most people, they don't go to university for the mind. They go to university so that they can get a skill which can help them get a job, which can enhance a better life for them. That's what most, unless you're a son of an aristocrat, you're a child of an aristocrat, you don't go to university to get a skill at all. You go to university, and you don't go to university to develop the mind. You go to get a skill so that then you go to the job market and get a job. But that is not what when you tell someone that you are going to university to improve your mind, that could be shooting yourself in the foot. And you have the essayist William Darasawiz. He says that basically an arts education, he people go to university in order to develop the mind. Of course, he's a graduate of Yale, and of course, he says that the purpose of education should be to develop the mind. So I think that's the purpose of education should be to develop the mind, and that's how then you get an education that's about developing the mind, and developing developing the mind, and developing the skill. So you could have a degree in history, and then you could have a degree in history, and then a minor in mechanical engineering, or you could have a degree in mechanical engineering and a minor in history. That's the way we are gonna help our people, so that we can have both. We don't want to have people who are mere workers. We want to have people that can think, people that can. We want to have people that can think, people that can improve the world. That's how we're going to have an Africa that functions. And I think when you have that, uh, then na rekodi ngoja kidogo. Ulikuwa unataka nakuja. I think you could have an indication that they also have the skill and the mind. I think you could have an education that develops both the skill and the mind, and I think that's why then William Darsawi says that to go to William Darsawi says that to go to university, you need an education that is both. You go to university to develop your mind, but then of course, not all people are children of aristocrats. So then you are going to university to develop your mind, and then also to develop your skills. So let's see about from the citizen Tanzania. That's a top story from Tanzania. That's a top story from Tanzania. And then, of course, another story from Tanzania, October 29, election violence inquiry. That's about October 29. That is the day of elections in Tanzania. They say it was a harrowing survivor counts. harrowing survival accounts of. So Tanzania has lost its innocence. Tanzania has lost its innocence. Basically, Tanzania lost its innocence. So basically, Tanzania lost its innocence. Basically, it's about developing the mind, and of course, Tanzania lost its innocence. And so, basically, it's about how do we make how then is that the country that Nyerere left? That's what we need to be asking. Is that the country that Nyerere left in the first place? So of course, Julius Nyerere experimented with that is African socialism. So socialism that was about creating an Africa where there could be everyone could have equal outcomes. Remember, but then of course that's not a natural human trait because by nature human beings are greedy. So basically, that means human beings are greedy by nature. So that means then they get to human beings are greedy by nature, so they get to want to acquire more for themselves. So basically, that was, I think, a wrong footing for Nyerere, but it was a great experiment in nation building. You find Tanzanians, for the most part, don't have the tribalism that other Africans have. So I think in that case, before the post-election violence of 19, before the election violence of that is October 29, you find that Tanzanians were the most stable country in Africa. Basically, yes, I think Tanzania was the most stable country in Africa beyond the October 29 election violence. Of course, right now that question is up for grabs, but before that, Tanzania was the most stable African country. And so I think right now what needs to happen is for Tanzania to look at the where the rain started beating them and to return to that. Let there be political pluralism in Tanzania so that you can encourage more political players. That's how you encourage dissent, that's how you encourage debate, that's how you encourage a sharpening of ideas, that's how you make a country great. And I think when you have that, then the country will be able to have, and then the country will be able to move forward. So I think I think that is how you'll be able to make the country move forward, and I think that's the way to be able to develop that country. So. How do you think? Do you think the innocence of Tanzania is gone? The innocence of Tanzania, where it was that country that was stable, even if elections came, you knew there would be no violence. But then October 29 surprised all of us. You said Samia Suluhu said the violence was caused by neighboring countries, which transported their problems into Tanzania. Maybe she was saying Kenya because Kenya has had riots and protests since the Gen Z revolution of 2024. So basically, that is what President Samia Suluhu was alluding to. But I think African socialism, known as Ujamaa, created a stable country, even though it is not as prosperous as one could imagine, but it was a great experiment in nation building. And of course, that's why after Nyerere, why before Mandela, there was Nyerere who practiced African socialism and who basically was a living saint. That is Nyerere. And so that's it for Tanzania, October 29 violence. So I think going forward, Tanzania just needs to allow for political pluralism so that then the country so that the country can build on its strength, so that the country can exert strength, and that is how the country is going to move forward. That's how the country is really going to move forward and ensure that it is at the absolutely bleeding edge of innovation. So that's it. That's it for now for Tanzania. I've looked at the top headlines anywhere from Nigeria, from Kenya, from Uganda. You are still on the case Uganda because of the recent elections, and I think that's how we will continue to build on that and ensure that we make the country truly, truly prosperous. So that's it for now. Bye for now.